You're never going to believe it, girls. A Christopher Nolan movie genuinely moved me, emotionally speaking.
Tell me what you remember.
A wife?
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be reviewing Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey adaptation. Now, normally what I do is I have a minimal spoiler section first and then a full spoiler section, but because this is based on a story that is very famous, been around for thousands of years, I'm going to be a bit more forthcoming with my feedback sooner. If all you want to know is if I enjoyed the film, if I rate it favorably, yes, I did, and I will land it somewhere in the realm of 4.5 stars. You have all of this Cecil B. DeMille sort of grand scale and spectacle, but with an incredible emotional depth and romanticism you might not expect from the latest Nolan blockbuster.
You're pining for a daddy you didn't even know, like some sniveling bastard.
Put your ring back on, honey tits. You haven't had enough porridge this morning to talk like that.
Now is when we will move into a some spoilers section. So this is where I won't give away the most significant, specific changes that would spoil the element of surprise, but I am going to speak somewhat freely about certain aspects of the film's material, insofar as The Odyssey being a story that is already very publicly known. Thus, I would say this section is for people who have already read the story, but maybe don't want to know every detail of this particular adaptation yet. We will save those bits for the final section of this review. The Odyssey is an ancient mythological tale by Homer. If you are not already familiar with the Homeric question, this refers to a topic of discussion amongst academics, historians, where they consider whether or not this tale, the Odyssey, was written by one person, that being Homer, or if the name Homer has simply come to be the sum of the parts of many different storytellers who have told and retold this story at various points throughout history. Because of how much older this work of source material is than the source material I have covered on my channel for other adaptations, trying to know the precise details of the story's origins is significantly more complicated. Now, I don't bring this point up to try to interject my own opinion on the Homeric question, but to merely establish how talking about this newest, or for that matter, any other adaptation of the Odyssey, and comparing it to its source material is a very different task than if I were to review a film that was being adapted from a book that was published in the 21st century, the 1800s, or anywhere in between, as has often been the case for the adaptations I have covered in recent years here on my channel. The Odyssey was originally a story told through people who would perform it out loud. It wasn't until further along in history that they eventually wrote the story down, but even when it was written down, you have to remember that the story originates in an ancient version of the Greek language. And in judging my YouTube analytics, I would assume that a fair few people in my audience will have read the Odyssey for the first time in the English language. Any person who speaks at least 2 languages will already know that there are always things, be they words or concepts, that don't neatly translate from one language to the next. As such, the Odyssey's especially older date of origin, combined with this subjectivity of things like translation, as well as the interpretation of art and fiction, it means that the Odyssey now exists with many variations that overlap with one another to varying degrees. I reread the Odyssey before I went to my press screening, which was on one of those massive IMAX screens, one of the biggest screens available almost anywhere to watch, if memory serves. Initially, I knew I needed to refresh myself on the details because I like to study adaptations and promote libraries in the process. You should support your local library because they let you read books for free. They also have DVDs that you can check out for free, ebooks, loads of resources, without charging you a rapidly increasing subscription price for it. I was reading through the Odyssey in an iambic pentameter version, but then I got an opportunity to cover another film here on my channel that I cannot tell you about just yet, but we will be getting to that perhaps sooner than you think. All that to say, time was running out, and I found another version of the Odyssey to read that was written in prose, and I read through that in about a day. Time was of the essence. What struck me most, almost immediately, in going on this journey of the Odyssey through Christopher Nolan's vision was how romantic it was. I very much got the romantic foundation of the source material, but I didn't necessarily assume that Christopher Nolan would stick to that or enhance it in any way. Prior to this, my perception of Christopher Nolan is that he's very much a technician. He has a meticulous attention to detail for building these grand epic spectacles, particularly once he built a name for himself in his career. I don't, however, as often find myself emotionally moved and overcome by Nolan's work. But as soon as they introduced the relationship of Odysseus and Penelope in this new version of the Odyssey, there was so much room given to Matt Damon and Anne Hathaway to show the depth of their love for one another. It's an ancient world where a happy, loving marriage is not a given, particularly for those people in high positions of power. Marriage is typically a political tool, but these two, they love each other. Their reunion in the book that I had read was so compelling that in watching this film and following Odysseus through all that he experiences, the stories you already know because you're a reader, you read books and you support your local library. The battle with the Cyclops, the encounter with Circe, you just feel it in your bones that these two are going to have a powerful reunion that's going to emotionally resonate because of how compelling and convincing their introduction in this film is. One of the most refreshing things about watching a film like Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey in the context of how it fits into the media landscape of today is that oftentimes when you have a new movie coming out in cinemas that has a 9-figure production budget, it ends up being a corporate product made by a committee. It's going to have hideous visual effects that were rushed and sloppily done. The story will lack a clear perspective or authorial intent. It's just disposable slop. But with The Odyssey, you don't have to deal with being inundated by sloppy VFX that break your immersion in the story. You all know what it feels like to watch a big corporate blockbuster where you see the actor in a scene and you know that they're standing in front of a green screen or a blue screen because of how rushed the work is, and you no longer believe that that character is in that world experiencing whatever is happening in that story. This is not a problem the Odyssey has. You are seeing actors wearing their costumes, being on location, be they among the trees, on the beach, out at sea. Everything you are seeing feels real, lived in, and immersive. This means that every bit of the dramatic and emotional stakes remains intact and undisrupted. It might seem like the sort of thing that should be the bare minimum, but nowadays, unfortunately, it's become increasingly rare. But with someone like Christopher Nolan, taking on a story like The Odyssey, it's exactly the standard I expected from him, and he fully delivered. What I wasn't expecting, as I've previously stated, was the level of emotional depth this adaptation has and how much I would connect to it. This interpretation of The Odyssey is forcing both Odysseus and, by extension, the audience to sit in the hideous reality of how cruel war is. Broadly speaking, if I were to put this in the context of other films releasing nowadays, and how this fits into the larger socio-political ongoings of the real world outside of the film, it feels like it's striking a similar chord to something like The Death of Robin Hood, or to a looser extent, believe it or not, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. I already explained my analysis of that in a previous review. Those stories, along with Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, feel like they're speaking to a broader shift in the cultural consciousness of really reckoning with the devastating consequences of war, and in this latest instance, with Christopher Nolan's Odyssey, challenging the mythology of war itself. I liked being able to read The Odyssey to refresh myself on the details that had slipped from my memory, but I also like seeing this new version of the story for what it does that is unique to this vision. I do have more feedback, but it feels necessary to also briefly address some of the upset that some people had about this new version. I I personally don't see what all the fuss was about, but I'm also more used to the routine of throwing myself into studying lots of different adaptations, so I see a very broad range of adaptations being similar or dissimilar to their source material. And I do not have one stance about adaptation always having to be similar or identical to its source material, because for me, it really does depend on the story and whomever is adapting it. I will give you an example. Romeo and Juliet, one of William Shakespeare's most famous plays. It's been retold and reimagined numerous times. Two of the more popular film adaptations of this story are the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli version and the 1996 Baz Luhrmann version. One is dressed up to appear more true to the original centuries-old period and setting, that being Verona in Italy. The other is modern to its original date of release, performed in North American English accents, though still in its original old-fashioned language, which is impressive considering how many modern adaptations like to do away with things like iambic pentameter. I enjoy both versions of Romeo and Juliet tremendously. Those are not the only differences between them, of course. Baz opted to have Romeo die in Juliet's arms after she woke up, even though the original version has him dying before she wakes up. That was such an unhinged twisting of the knife, and you know what? Baz is a wicked genius for doing that. It's a change, but it works. In reading through the Odyssey shortly before seeing this new adaptation of it, I knew that the film would be close to 3 hours long in its runtime, but even so, I still had the thought that the original story is so informationally dense. There are so many details and longer drawn-out conversations, interactions, and whatnot, that even with this longer runtime, I knew that they were going to inevitably be doing a bit of pruning or consolidating. I was expecting that, and that's exactly what happened. Broadly speaking, I do recommend that people read the source material books of adaptations if those books are of a higher quality, and of course, I would say that this applies to the Odyssey. If you read the story, you get a lot more information because print is the medium more conducive to being informationally dense. Nolan's version has all of the epic spectacle that makes the most of film as a visual medium. It's showcasing numerous phenomenal performers at the top of their game, especially Matt Damon and Anne Hathaway, simply because they're probably given the most to do, and their love story is a major focal point of the story. Robert Pattinson is so despicable in this, so we will also give full marks to him for playing an insufferable villain. John Leguizamo was also devastating to watch. The fact that he, of all people, would be cast in this, I will admit that going into watching this for the first time, I couldn't help but wonder whether or not we perhaps could have done this movie in iambic pentameter. It would have been very full circle for the Prince of Cats. What art thou drawn among these heartless hinds?
What art thou drawn among these heartless hinds?
You have highly skilled actors in your ensemble, many of whom have experience performing theater. It's very common that the Odyssey has been transcribed in iambic pentameter. Did anyone have the actors on this press tour perform a couple of lines in iambic pentameter? Because if you didn't, you are wasting your opportunities, and I will not stand for it. Even so, the prose was mostly fine for me. The one, and I would say only time that I felt my immersion waver because of the text is when Menelaus, as portrayed by John Bernthal, said the word gossip. I ended up going home afterwards and looking up the word gossip just to try to see how old of a word it was. Apparently, it is at the very least a few centuries old, so I don't have as much room to complain. It's a nitpick, I know, so keep in mind I'm only regarding it as a nitpick as opposed to a fundamental flaw with the film itself. I don't have an issue with the Odyssey being performed in North American English accents because, for the most part, the way things are written and the way the actors deliver their lines, they make it feel like you are in another time, more specifically an older time. I'm immune to the notion that you cannot reinterpret old stories in yet another type of accent in the English language because, as I've already said, by this point I'm highly acclimated to things like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. There are constantly older period piece stories being performed in British English, despite being stories from or set in places like France, Italy, the ancient Roman Empire, it really makes no difference to me at this point. The Odyssey is not a story that was created in English. It has grown so famous and widespread to the point that it's known far beyond that one region, and as such, it's only natural that wherever that story spreads, the artists in those places are going to want to retell the story and do so in a language they're accustomed to. Hypothetically, if Brazilian artists decide that they would like to do a version of the Odyssey, they're probably going to do it in Brazilian Portuguese. There are Indian adaptations of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and all of this to say, people being confused that a Hollywood adaptation is going to pull from actors who already work and are established in Hollywood as an industry, well, you're being surprised by that. It's different, it's unusual. The action is about what I would expect to see in a Christopher Nolan film, but I think a massive part of what makes it as impressive as it is what I talked about before. That being how practical and real all of it looks. Hundreds of performers for these larger battles, actors being out on boats that are in a storm. I believe it because the performers are out doing things. They're interacting with each other and the environment immediately around them. The Cyclops mostly works too, although his eye does look like VFX, but I'm assuming that this was the preferable option for the people making the film. I don't know how easy it would have been for them to apply a prosthetic on an actor's forehead and find a way to make that eye move, but that's really getting into nitpicking territory again. Overall, I was impressed by how convincing Poseidon's son is, and you would know that lore if you read the story, or perhaps have a fixation on this mythology, or you even just watched the film, because they did say that he is Poseidon's son. Also, Athena is Poseidon's niece, though they don't mention that particular detail in this film. I suppose it's not really lore that is necessary to follow this adaptation, so I can easily see why it wouldn't get a mention in this 3-hour film. When they introduced us to Odysseus and where he currently is, that being stuck on Calypso's island, they proceed to have him retell his story while on that island, which is a change from the original version where he gets off that island first, he lands elsewhere, he retells his story to the king and queen at court so that they may be endeared to him and give him the resources he needs to be able to return home to Ithaca. This is an alteration that makes sense to me for the logistics of pruning some of the extra bits so that you don't find yourself running over 3 hours. But also, if you're going to cast someone as skilled and high profile as Charlize Theron to play Calypso, you might as well get more out of that casting. There are already multiple stops on Odysseus's journey from the Trojan War to his ending up on Calypso's island. If you take the audience through the many stops and events of that journey, you might as well follow that momentum to bring him back to Ithaca in one treacherous trip, instead of having yet another stop and detour for him to take. Circe was probably one of my most anticipated parts of the story because when I was reading through it, I had kept a list open of the characters from the film and which actors would be playing them, and Samantha Morton was a lead in one of my favorite Steven Spielberg films, Minority Report. She was acting circles around everyone in that movie when they're on the run, and she just keeps telling Tom Cruise, wait, wait, wait. To me, that was cinema. Thus, I knew she was going to fully deliver in Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. I wouldn't officially categorize Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey as a comedy, but there were a couple of moments that made me laugh out loud, usually because the men were landing somewhere and being very presumptuous, but all the while I know what's lying in wait for them because I did a read-through of the story before I watched this film. When they're going into the Cyclops cave, I knew what was going to pop out. When they enter Circe's home, and she reacts with fear at having a bunch of strange men appear out of nowhere like that with weapons and armor, I laughed because I knew these men were about to have the ultimate makeover. You messed with the wrong one.
You are messing with the wrong man!
If you've seen Minority Report, you know what Samantha Morton was capable of, so I assume that even if she were to be given crumbs in this screenplay, if anyone could make a meal out of them, it would be her. And she did. Though to be fair, they actually did take the time and space to say a lot more about her perspective, the material reality of what soldiers visiting lands entails. And she gave Odysseus a harsh but entirely deserved reality check, and I was living for every bit of what she was giving with her performance. I do want to get into more of the specifics, translation, spoilers. There's more that I could tiptoe around in this section, but the ensemble is so large and the story so eventful, which you would know if you read it already, or if perhaps you've seen the film and now you're watching my review. But all that to say, I want to be able to talk in more detail. So the final bit of feedback I would include in this specific section of some spoilers is that, to no one's surprise, Ludwig Göransson delivered like he always does. I have to recommend watching the behind-the-scenes featurette about the work he did in making this film's score feel more ancient, the instrumentation, restoration, the emphasis on bronze as a material. It was really interesting to follow. Overall, I recommend the Odyssey. It was well worth experiencing this on the big screen. It's cheesy to say, but yes, see it on the biggest screen possible.
You're a man who needs to control his fate.
Now let's go through things with full details and spoilers. The film opens with Travis Scott as a bard, and immediately I was hooked. This was done as a way of paying homage to the Odyssey originating as a story told by way of spoken poetry. I knew about this particular inclusion before seeing the film, and I was completely on board upon seeing the finished result because I have read many a Baz Luhrmann interview where he has explained how he has used modern music as a means of translating certain emotions in period pieces, the rebellious spirit of older time periods to a younger modern audience of whatever film he's making. It's a really effective storytelling tool, and although Travis Scott's performed bits are brief in the film, they worked. We get a brief introduction to Sinan, Elliot Page's character, as the one who explains that the giant horse behind him is an offering to Athena. Sinan is not a character directly included in the Odyssey, but he has appeared in other stories about the Trojan War, so that is further proof of how Christopher Nolan has been especially thorough in researching this topic to make this film. Sinan is a smaller character insofar as screen time goes, but the way that he's used in the story opened a new avenue that I thoroughly enjoyed. What Christopher Nolan did is to make Sinan the younger brother of Antinous, Robert Pattinson's character, who is one of the primary antagonists. Of Penelope's numerous suitors, he's the one that gets the most screen time and material in the original and also in this adaptation. What they reveal is that when various men and boys from Ithaca needed to leave to fight in the Trojan War, they used a raffle system. Antinous drew one of the items that indicated he was going to be drafted, but he panicked, tried to force his younger brother, Sinan, to go in his place. And this was not something done discreetly, by the way. Odysseus saw this whole thing, and he let this family save face by immediately spinning this story that Sinan volunteered to take Antinous' place. That's not what happened. Sinan dies along with many other men that Odysseus has led in battle, so when we're in the flashback of his journey to end up on Calypso's island, the part where he visits the underworld, Sinan tells Odysseus to give Antinous back his shame. He had the little totem from when he was drafted. I love this alteration for so many reasons. For one, it adds an extra element of revenge. Who doesn't love a good vengeance quest? Moreover, it deepens our understanding of who Antinous is. He is constantly shown to be espousing an exaggerated nobility of character that is completely disingenuous. He spins this story about how he wanted to go fight in the Trojan War, but Odysseus insisted that he stay behind because Ithaca needed him. Lies, Manelli, lies. In the original version of the Odyssey, when Odysseus kicks off his attack on the suitors, more or less the first thing he does is shoot an arrow into Antinous' neck, but in the film, they have Odysseus do that to Polybus instead. Since we've just spent the last couple of hours stewing in the evil deeds of Antinous, it makes sense that you would wait just a bit longer so that you have him around for more of this drawn-out battle sequence, and have the vengeance be served further into that fight. The build-up makes it more satisfying when it finally happens. Furthermore, since we're talking about Antinous anyway, writing him to be engaged in an affair with Melantho makes sense because of what I said before about the need for consolidating material in the adaptation process. Yes, they had Penelope mention in the film how the suitors have been going after and even corrupted some of her servants, but when you have an ensemble of characters as large as this film has, and you're already at a runtime of 3 hours, there simply isn't enough time to introduce us to even more suitors and servants and have them be shown to be engaging in those shenanigans. Keep things focused in the story. So then, when Penelope turns Melantho out and she gets trapped in the room with all of the suitors Odysseus is about to unleash his full wrath and combat skills on, the point still gets made. In the original, there's this whole thing about each and every female servant who had betrayed the household being executed once Odysseus has finished dispatching of the suitors. What works in print or in recited poetry might not work as well in a feature film, because adding extra details like those can start to feel needlessly tangential when you're now in the film medium. Broadly speaking, one of the more significant shifts in this adaptation relative to its source material is that we don't see as much of the gods themselves. Although Zendaya appears every so often as Athena, much of the time we don't actually see the gods, more of the gods anyway. In the original story, Telemachus decides to go on this journey when Athena visits him, but she's in disguise at yet another gathering of these insufferable suitors who want to win Penelope. You do see a stranger visit Telemachus in Nolan's Odyssey, but they don't explicitly show you some sort of magical transformation of the stranger we see into Zendaya as Athena. Initially, I thought they might simply be waiting to reveal that detail, but what they ended up revealing instead about Athena was something else entirely. Before Odysseus leaves on his journey, Penelope gifts him an Athena pin. It's not only a token of her affection, a reminder of her and their love for one another, but also, it's something very distinct, so that if anyone were to visit Ithaca claiming to have met Odysseus, if they do not describe the pin as part of what he's wearing, she will be able to know that they're lying. With that detail, and these occasional glimpses of Zendaya's Athena when we see Odysseus in his flashback memories, appearing to Odysseus at various points throughout the film, I figured that they were doing something different with Athena, where she would appear as a reminder of Penelope, of Odysseus loving his wife, wanting to go home. Well, imagine my shock when they finally do the big reveal. The reason Athena appears to Odysseus in the form that we see her, of Zendaya, remember that gods can change form so they can look like many different things, is that when Odysseus led his men to invade Troy, they snuck in by way of the giant horse. They opened the gates, allowing Agamemnon and the other soldiers waiting inside to unleash the full fury of their military violence. What does that entail? Attacking other soldiers, guards, and whatnot, but also the civilians, including a woman whom Odysseus vividly remembers begging for her life. And that woman is played by whomst? Zendaya. Thus, Athena is not just the personification of Odysseus missing the wife whom he adores, but also the manifestation of his guilt over being a war criminal. This was not the angle I expected Christopher Nolan to take, but it was nonetheless most welcome. The further we follow Odysseus through these memories, the more we learn that he is haunted by the men he led who didn't survive the war itself, the journey they went on afterwards to try to return home. I am not making the argument that the gods do not exist in Nolan's Odyssey. We see the Cyclops, who is the son of Poseidon, and the Cyclops even says that he's the son of Poseidon. And Poseidon made the weather absolutely nightmarish so that they were constantly struggling to get home. They did not heed the warning about leaving the sacred cows alone, and it doomed all of these men, except for the one and only who didn't eat of the sacred cow. That being Odysseus. But what about your sacred cow?
Your sacred cows.
The influence of the gods can be felt here and there in this adaptation, but the alterations Nolan made are in service of this larger idea he's presenting, where humankind is not absolved of the decisions and actions they take. They do not get to use the gods as an excuse for their own misdeeds and the decisions they made. In the original story, Odysseus talks to the Cyclops. He tries to get on his good side by gifting him wine, but the Cyclops says it doesn't matter, he's still going to eat the men. Therefore, once the Cyclops is very drunk, that's when the men are able to blind him. In Nolan's Odyssey, they never made any effort to speak to the Cyclops or reason with him. And to add insult to injury, Odysseus shoots an arrow at him after they've gotten out of the cave. You are free. You could have just ran off back to the ships at that point. You incurred the wrath of Poseidon. You did that. The gods didn't make you pillage villages to steal rations, setting fire to their homes and try to act like you're just doing what's needed to get back home. You were the ones to violate Zeus's law. That's another concept that the film repeatedly emphasizes. It's that you should do unto others as you would have done unto you, but more specifically, the rationale or the justification is that, well, that stranger or that beggar could be a god in disguise, so that's why you should do it. But it's really a way of trying to contextualize this modern idea of just be nice to people, be kind, have empathy. And it is Odysseus violating Zeus's law by way of the Trojan horse that is at the very epicenter of all the guilt that he has eating away at him. Athena pops up more in the original story, offering bits of wisdom, advice, some occasional magic where it's needed. She will do things like alter Odysseus's appearance to make him more or less attractive if he needs to be in disguise, or be more dashing and appealing to charm people that can potentially give him the supplies he needs to get home. By the way, the version I read before I watched this adaptation was calling Odysseus by the name Ulysses, and it was calling Athena by the name Minerva. If you are planning on reading the Odyssey for the first time, just be advised that sometimes, depending on how things are translated in that particular version, they will use different names. Is it the Latin name? Is it the Roman name? You can always look up certain characters and see which names they go by if you want to be sure of which character you're following. But back to the role that the gods play in this adaptation. I really like this interpretation because this brings us to one of the talking points that I was vaguely aware of despite my best efforts to remove myself from actively using as much social media. The black armor. I will admit that when I saw this in early promotional material, I wasn't a fan of it. It felt far too anachronistic for my liking. I didn't understand why that would be the design. Now, having seen the armor in its full context, I don't mind it actually. So let me explain where I landed with this. The black armor with the golden skeletal design on the back of the neck, this is specifically Agamemnon's armor. What we see of Agamemnon is him doing things like gathering soldiers, invading Troy once Odysseus and his men open the gate from inside, and also sacrificing his own child to the gods. Now, why would he do a thing like that? Well, the usual reasons. Power, a lust for victory in war. Did the gods directly ask him to do that? And even if they had, that was still his choice. It's also directly responsible for his downfall. That is what turns his wife against him. In what other way do we spend time with this character, Agamemnon? When Odysseus visits or convenes with the underworld. When Agamemnon is still alive and you see him among his men before or during these violent attacks on others, this is partially a way of making him stand out visually among a sea of hundreds and hundreds of people in these scenes. However, despite this victory he's going to have, you'll defeat your so-called enemies in the Trojan War, but you have already sealed your fate when you sacrificed your own child. Thus, Agamemnon, in all of his anachronistic, overly chic black armor, is a harbinger of death, but he's also a dead man walking. Now do you see the vision? And the very notion of sacrificing one's own child for power, for a military victory, that opens this adaptation up to so much analysis from various scholars. I mean, decades from now, cultural and historical anthropologists will be able to write papers on Nolan's Odyssey and use a detail like that as being symbolic of the larger sentiments of this time period, of the resentment and outright hostility against the broader global war machine, against empire. And this is why we need to normalize not being overly committed to our early superficial impressions of a work of fiction. when we do not have the full story to judge in its entirety. Forming an early opinion is fine, but if you follow film ongoings consistently, you should already know that promotional material doesn't always paint an accurate or nuanced perspective on what it's advertising. By all means, form your early opinion, but maintain the train of thought simultaneously that you may very well change your mind. Before I forget or decide that this review is far too long to carry on further, I want to make sure I share a very specific nitpick I had about this adaptation. It was the thing I was really upset didn't get included. In the original story, when Odysseus returns home, Athena has magically altered his appearance in such a way so that he will not be immediately recognized by the people who knew him before. They worked around this in the film by simply having him hide his face. It's been 20 years since he left, and Eumaeus' vision is mostly gone now. After the battle against the suitors in the original story, Penelope needs further proof that this man is in fact Odysseus. Her long-lost husband finally returned to her. She tests him by saying something about moving their wedding bed, and he gets really upset with her, and he goes on this long explanation about how he built their wedding bed by hand, he built it into this tree, and the tree is immovable, thus the bed itself is immovable, so what the heck is she talking about with this notion of moving their wedding bed? It's iconic, it's romantic, and you know what else? It wasn't in the movie. They finally reunite. We've been waiting for this to happen for 3 hours at this point, and you don't have him talk about building the wedding bed. Disappointment. That's what I felt. I know it's a nitpick. It's not fundamentally necessary information to be able to follow the story as it's been presented, adapted. But it was one of those details that I was really looking forward to seeing, especially when the movie got started, and immediately it was hooking me and making me fully believe and get invested in this love story of Odysseus and Penelope because of how fully locked in and committed both Matt Damon and Anne Hathaway were, and how the material really set them up for success. And you don't have that lead to the speech about him building their wedding bed by hand. Christopher Nolan, you need some romance girlies in your circle. Now, if you haven't read the story and you're simply judging the film on its own merits, of course a nitpick like this is not going to apply to how you experience the film, because you don't have that context of which details have been modified or omitted. There is so much more that could be said about this film. I mean, the fact that he shows mercy to the suitors that surrender, it was incredible. But if I keep going over the details of every character, every plot development, every tiny comparison between the source material and the adaptation, this video will never be finished and I will never be able to publish it. So I will say full props to the noteworthy performers. Hollywood, you had better start casting Samantha Morton in more films. I need to see her in more movies at the cinema. If you would like to follow more of my running commentary on adaptations, not only can you subscribe to my YouTube channel, but you can also look through my book versus movie playlist, which is where I share all of my thoughts on various adaptations. But next week, we're actually going to be covering an upcoming rom-com. See you then.